It is my great pleasure. And work in teacher education, looking at for practicing, critical issues in teacher education, particularly students. And so, and I kind of run into that every couple of months.
It's true.
So we've had a good buzz. Anyway, it's my great pleasure.
Thank you. It's great to be here, you all. I am going to try to stay on this side of the podium and avoid the cords. But if I trip over it at some point, we'll all have a nice laugh. It'll be like a nice slapstick lecture. So the title of this talk is Practicing Justice Practice for Critical Practice Teacher Education. And it's situated inside of some contemporary debates in the field of teacher education around what really is the relationship between practicing teaching, and the work of preparing social justice educators. So I'm going to try to dive into that conversation that's happening in the field with this talk and with some research that I've done. A little bit of a map of what that's going to look like. I'm going to start by sort of grounding us in one central conundrum in teacher ed, and then we'll think together about a big overarching research question that kind of addresses that conundrum. And then I'll take you into one deep dive into one study that I did recently, and then we'll think about what it might look like to go from there and think towards future questions, and then we can have a discussion about it. So this central conundrum that I talked about a second ago, I like to call one of the central conundrums in teacher education the mismatch problem. And that's because over the past 30 to 40 years of research on teacher ed, there have been a lot of different mismatches that have gotten brought up. And they don't get talked about a lot together, but when you bring them together, they're illustrative of the fact that those of us who think a lot about the preparation of teachers are facing a few mismatches that make it really hard to do the work of preparing teachers. So the first of those mismatches is the apprenticeship of observation, which I'm sure lots of you are thinking about in your coursework or in your own research. This idea that Morty brought into the conversation in the 70s, that as new teachers, or really all teachers, learned to teach through a very, very long apprenticeship of the time when they were students, watching their teachers who taught them over many, many, many years. And this is a mismatch between the past and the present, because in teacher education programs, when we're preparing teachers, we're often teaching people to take up really student-centered, constructivist approaches to teaching and learning, which often are mismatching with what people experience during that apprenticeship. Oftentimes, people didn't experience student-centered, constructivist approaches to teaching and learning in their own experience as students through that very, very long apprenticeship, and yet in these teacher education programs, they're being told about some other new approach to teaching and learning, and that's a real hard thing for those of us who prepare teachers to wrestle with. The second mismatch, sort of brought into the literature in the 1980s by Dr. Feynman, Nemser, and Fluchman, is this idea of the two worlds pitfall. This idea that there's a real mismatch between the university and the field. The teacher education programs involve coursework, which often is at the university, and fieldwork, which often is in the schools, and the kind of teaching that is promoted in both of those spaces often are at odds with one another. They are often not the same kind of teaching and learning, and student teachers feel that very, very strongly as they're being prepared. So that's another mismatch. The third mismatch, Mary Kennedy called the problem of enactment, which is this idea that you can know something and believe something very strongly, and still really struggle to be able to do it. So this is a mismatch between knowing and doing that novice teachers experience when they might have really bought into the idea that there should be a lot of discourse in a classroom, but actually not be able to pull it off in their own early attempts at making that happen. So together, these three mismatches And they ground, I would argue, all of the problems that we have in teacher education and teacher education scholarship. So the definition we're going to work with for the remainder of this talk of the mismatch problem is the idea that teaching people to enact practices that rarely occur in their environment is difficult and complex work. And the reason for that is that learners have few examples of that practice to emulate, and that the practice is difficult to attempt because the environment isn't conducive to it. So to dive into this a little bit deeper, I just want to give you an analogy. So I want you to imagine that you're a French teacher, and your job is to teach students here in New Brunswick to speak French. And none of your students speak French at home. None of them speak French with their classmates or with their friends. But your job as their teacher is to get them to speak in French. So here you've got a mismatch problem, right? The learners have very few examples of the practice of French speaking to emulate. And when they try to speak in French outside of your class, the environment pushes against it. They speak to somebody in French, they get spoken back to in English. They say, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're doing. It's very difficult to actually keep it going. So as a French teacher, you actually have to change the way you teach, because if you were teaching something people could try in their environment, you could say, I'm going to teach you a set of things. Now your job between now and next class is to go practice doing it. Practice it a few times, come back again, and we'll figure out how it went, and we'll grow your practice even further. But with French, you can't do that. You can't say, go out, practice speaking to a bunch of people who only speak English, see how it goes, and you'll get better over time. So you have to actually create the practice opportunities for French speaking inside of your own class. It becomes your responsibility to create the opportunities to practice and or to change the environment in which the students are in so that they can practice. And I would argue we have the same problem in teacher education. That the kind of teaching that we promote in teacher education teacher education programs is like a foreign language, and particularly social justice oriented teaching. We say to people, go out and try this, but the environment isn't conducive to it, so their attempts get shut down, and they have very few examples to see, which means that we, as teacher educators, have a different kind of responsibility in relationship to the work of preparing people for social justice. So what this has meant for me, what it really comes down to, is that how we teach teachers matters just as much as what we teach them. We can develop a curriculum that's oriented around educational justice, but if we don't pay attention to the ways in which we're developing opportunities to practice and opportunities to see the kind of work that we want to have novice teachers take up, we're actually only just developing a French class for people who are never actually going to go out and be able to speak the language. So what that's led me to in my work is an overarching research question, which I think everything I've done up to this point is in some way related to this question. What can teacher educators do to meaningfully influence novice teachers' practice at particularly complex and pivotally important aspects of teaching that remain stubbornly absent in schools? And for me, that has focused on two primary things, two things that are pivotally important and stubbornly absent. And those are facilitating student talk. You know from lots of research that it's a good idea for kids to talk in classrooms about content, but yet it's not happening. So there's the research that it's really important. Here's the research that is stubbornly absent. There's many more articles that would back up those 2 points, but if we could make a dent in that, we could really make a difference for kids' experience. The second of these really important but stubbornly absent things that I focus on in my work is the work of centering justice in teaching. So just like with facilitating talk, there's lots of research that centering justice is going to be a good move for developing students as people and as academics and as just community members. But there's also a lot of research indicating that it's stubbornly absent, that schools are actually places that claim neutrality when it comes to issues of justice and that don't support students to develop their own ability to be able to fight back against injustice around them. So what this has led me to, that interest in those two things, are a medley of projects. I'm not going to talk through each one of them, but there are lots of them. And all of them have focused on trying to understand how to design opportunities for novice teachers to actually practice and see those parts of teaching that are so stubbornly absent that we know from lots of research are important. I'm going to take us into a deep dive into one of these. So this one is a study that's about the relationship between teacher educators' practice, so instructors of teacher education programs, and novice teachers' subsequent practice. So can we understand anything about the relationship between what we do as teacher educators in programs and what novice teachers go on and do. So the research questions from that piece were these. How did the teacher educators, and I'll talk to you about who they are, how did they prepare novices to facilitate talk and to center justice? How did they do that? What was their pedagogy like? What did it look like? To what extent teachers then go on and do those two things in their work with kids? And what characterized the relationship between the teacher educator's practice and the novice teacher's teaching? So we're going to dive into a kind of atypical case. So I selected a site that was atypical in that it offered a pretty rich case for understanding the relationship between issues of justice and methods courses in particular, because there were actually 3 teacher educators teaching a course together. It was an accelerated program that had given that had sort of pushed together 3 classes: a math methods class, a literacy methods class, and a foundations class that focused on equity and justice, and given it a lot more time. So it was a class where there was three courses amount of time. It wasn't like it was a shorter course, but the instructors worked together to design the course. So it was hopefully a site where we would see a lot of integration between the kind of practice work that tends to happen in methods courses and the work on justice and equity that tends to happen in foundations courses and teacher education programs. And if we could begin to see that relationship, we might understand some things about how those things get taught. It was also in a practice-based program, and by that I mean the program itself said that it was practice-based, but there were a few things about the program that really made it that way. This course had 8 assignments in it that included video, so the practice of the teachers was coming back to the instructors very frequently. There were rehearsals of teaching that were happening really frequently in this course. As part of the design, there were lots of videos of teaching or explicit demonstrations of teaching that were used during every single class meeting. And novices routinely analyzed their own practice on video and their peers' practice. So all of these things led us to believe that actually we were going to be able to see a case of people really working with the practice of teaching around issues of justice and around student talk. And then we followed novices through 2 worlds. So the 2 worlds of the university as a field. We videotaped the days that were co-taught by the literacy methods and the foundations instructors. We excluded the math part from this, so we were focusing particularly on literacy. And then we looked at video of the K-6 teaching these novices were doing. They were in a lot of different contexts, ranging from rural to urban, in classrooms. All of them, however, were in classrooms where students of color were in the majority, and all of them were teaching in poverty-impacted communities. And we collected a whole lot of data. So we collected video of the teacher education coursework. We collected video of the novice teacher classrooms. We collected the novice teacher lesson plans and reflections on those lesson plans. We collected course material from the teacher educators. And then we did a series of things, and I'm going to actually dive into the methods a little bit deeper. But we had 4 different phases of data analysis where we developed a code book. We then coded the novice teacher video and plans and reflections, and then the teacher education video. And then we did a crosswalk analysis of those 2 things. We wanted to know what were the teachers doing in schools, and then we wanted to know to what extent was that stuff they learned in their methods classes. So to think about those codes for a second, I'm going to go back to this slide that you'll remember, because the codes we used to analyze the video were basically from these same ideas that I was talking about at the beginning. Our facilitating student talk codes, these are just a sampling of them. They came from pre-existing research that I have done and several colleagues have done, identifying aspects of student talk. So eliciting and responding to students was one of the codes, orienting students with another was another, orienting students with text was another. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk mostly about the reflections that the novice teachers did of their own teaching. So we applied these codes to how the novice teachers wrote about videos of their own teaching that they watched. So in these reflections, if they say something like, I think students want to ask better questions, that would be on the student code. If they said something like, or if they said something like, in that moment, I think students turn and talk to each other, that would get a orienting students to each other code. If they said, I think I should have explicitly asked them to include evidence from the text, that would get an orienting students to text code. There were other codes that had to do with facilitating talk, but it's important that you know how this works to understand the findings. So we also had a set of codes about centering justice. That was harder to come up with the code book for. Why? Because there are a lot of frameworks relating to the work of social justice teaching, anti-oppressive teaching, lots of various different ways of thinking about questions of justice. You could take a decolonial perspective, you could take a multicultural perspective. All of these things have a variety of implications depending on the place that you take. We did a lot of thinking about this. And in the end, we ended up following on, a woman named Connie North did a survey basically of lots of different frameworks for social justice in education and found trends across them, which she identified as years of social justice. This is not an exhaustive list, but it was what we ended up using. So she identified one tension in all the literature on social justice teaching between redistribution and recognition, meaning a tension between the idea that when you are fighting for justice, what you're doing is recognizing that there are a variety of cultures, a variety of groups, a variety of differences, versus a perspective of actually trying to redistribute resources so that they are more equitably distributed across all people. That recognition and redistribution are sometimes in tension inside of the social justice literature. There was a similar tension she identified across the literature between sameness and difference. The idea that when you are fighting for justice requires that you understand things that people have in common, that people have rights to life, liberty, property, etc., but that also there are differences across people in relationship to various identities, various cultural groups, various histories of oppression that lead to different needs in the moment, and that these things are both simultaneously true and also necessarily in tension in some ways. And then a third was a tension between macro processes of oppression, so structural oppression, and micro processes of oppression, for example, microaggressions. That all of these things are sitting across the literature in a variety of ways when it comes to social justice education generally, but that it's sometimes very in tension. So we used her framework as our code book. So as an example of what we would code, we looked at also those reflections, and we said, okay, any talk about the importance of authority, respect, or dignity, remember the historical market, so groups got a recognition code. So something like, I realized that I haven't read any books to my kids, and I characters who wore a headscarf. So I picked the book, blah, 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 because I was trying to make sure that my students felt. So that would get a recognition code. I could walk you through all the different codes for all of these different things, but they each had different sets of codes like that. What we found is an absence. And representing findings is actually very difficult when what you find is an absence. So what I'm gonna try to do is talk to you a little bit using numbers. However, because numbers are actually helpful for illustrating absences, when you're doing primarily qualitative research, it's hard to represent an absence because you're mostly using people's words. So while this is not quantitative research, in this presentation, I'm going to show you some numbers, but keep your qualitative research hats on. Just so you know, that's why we're moving into some numerical representation. So the first finding from this research was that novice teachers much more frequently reflected on how they facilitated student talk than they did on how they centered justice. 5 times more frequently, in fact. So when we put the codes that I just described onto those novice teacher reflections, what we mostly saw was them talking about the way they elicited talk, the way they oriented students to one another's ideas, the way they pushed students in and out of text. They were doing that 5 times more frequently than any of the codes relating to centering justice that applied to those texts. However, we knew, because we had watched all the video of the teacher education coursework and spent a lot of time with the teacher education course materials and interviews with the teacher educators, that there was actually a lot of work on centering justice in the teacher education coursework. So we wondered what accounted for that discrepancy. So they're working a lot on centering justice, but it's not showing up in the way they write about their teaching. Why is that? So we hypothesized that it might have to do with how teacher educators were teaching both of those aspects, facilitating talk and centering justice, rather than whether they were teaching it. It maybe wasn't a curricular issue about what was being included. It was maybe more of a pedagogical issue about how those things were being taught. So to investigate that hypothesis, we applied some more codes. So these codes we applied only to the teacher educator videos. So the videos where novice teachers were working with teacher educators in their coursework. So they weren't teaching kids in these videos, they were inside of their methods classes with teacher educators. And we applied pedagogies of enactment codes and pedagogies of investigation codes. So these are concepts that also come out of the literature from a piece by Grossman and McDonald in 2008. Pedagogies of enactment are pedagogical practices of teacher educators that are designed to support novices to enact, to embody, to attempt teaching, whereas pedagogies of investigation are pedagogical practices of teacher educators designed to support novices to teach, to analyze, to investigate. Both are very important, but they're actually kind of different. So pedagogies of enactment might include analyzing videos of teaching or modeling the person, work analysis, where you're looking at student work together, or lesson plan analysis. So the artifacts of the work of teaching are the center of what it is you're working on when you're engaged in the pedagogy of enactment. Pedagogies of investigation might be discussions of articles about teaching, where you're thinking a lot about the work of teaching, or maybe lectures or guest speakers, maybe students are giving presentations, miscellaneous instructional activities that do not involve teachers in doing the work of teaching, or explicitly watching the work of teaching as a representation of the thing they might want to attempt and try. We can talk more about that further. So we applied those codes to the video of teacher education. And what we found was that when teacher educators were using pedagogies of investigation, so that's these, right? Articles kind of looks like a typical seminar that might also happen in a liberal arts classroom. When they were using pedagogies of investigation, they actually taught about centering justice more frequently than they taught about facilitating talk. Not much more, but a little bit more. However, when they were using pedagogies of enactment, so when they were rehearsing teaching, modeling teaching, looking at videos of teaching, they talked about facilitating student talk 31.7 times more frequently. So the work of centering justice was happening inside of seminar-style investigation work, but not happening inside of rehearsals of teaching, videos of teaching, models of teaching, all of those moments where people are actually trying on the work of teaching in some way. So we thought this was fascinating. So to show you just a little bit of what that looked like, I'm going to show, this is a very, very, very short example of a pedagogy of enactment from our data. So this is not representative of all pedagogies of enactment, it just gives you a glimpse. The teacher educator has just done a model of herself doing an interactive read aloud inside of her classroom. Because now the teachers are going to go do interactive read alouds with their elementary school kids. She says, what did you notice about my teaching in relation to listening and responding to students? What's something that you noticed? One novice says, you asked probing questions. She says, what might I have been asking those probing questions? Why might I have been asking those probing questions? What might have the purpose been of that then? One says to elicit responses, another says to invest children. She says, any other thoughts about why I might ask probing questions? To position students competently, checking for understanding. This is just a little 5 seconds moment of this teacher education class. The reason I'm showing it to you is that moments like this were never happening when people were talking about centering justice. So this followed a model of teaching. So that's what we're going to call a representation of teaching. If we think back to pedagogies of enactment, that's why this is coded as pedagogy of enactment. It includes a decomposition of teaching. So the teacher educator says, what did you notice about my teaching in relation to listening and responding to students? Listening and responding to students is one small part of teaching. It's not the whole of teaching. So she identifies a part of teaching. She could have said, what did you notice about the way that I managed behavior? What did you notice about the way I oriented kids to one another's ideas? It could be anything. She's decomposed it to a very small thing. And then she has a discussion of the instructional judgment and rationale behind that visible action of her listening and responding to students. And then she engages her novices in a discussion of that. The reason I'm showing this to you is that I want us to think about what it would look like for something like this to focus on centering justice. Because I think we have taught about justice in a set of ways that are really focused on sort of seminar-style discussion of ideas, and it's been difficult for people to imagine what it would look like to work on justice issues inside of the practice of teaching. So I just took out the few things that the teacher educator says that are focused on facilitating student talk. And I want us to imagine what it might look like to do this in relationship to justice. She could say, what did you notice about my teaching in relation to decentering whiteness, in deconstructing biases, acknowledging privilege, affirming students' cultural practices. She could show models of what that looks like and actually engage people in analytic work about why she might have done the things she done and what they afforded and what they didn't afford. And we didn't see that kind of work happening inside of this particular context. I have a question about whether that would be true across the board or not. I want to say one more thing about this study before we start talking, which is that we also had another set of codes that we applied to this data. Planning codes and instruction codes. So whenever novice teachers or teacher educators were talking about the work of planning, which I define as decisions made before children are present. So that's what book to read, what major questions to ask, what major tasks to include, what learning goals to plan towards. When anybody was talking about planning, we got that code. Instruction, however, are the decisions made while children are present. So there are a lot of teaching decisions in that case. Who to call on, how to follow up on a student's idea that they've just shared, when to speak, when to wait for children to speak, how to engage particular children in particular moments. Those are decisions that can't get made before teaching. They're instructional decisions. So we also applied these codes to the teacher educator data and the novice teacher data. And of those data excerpts that were coded with all the data, not everything is actually about planning and instruction, but of the data that did have a planning or an instruction code and a centering social justice code, 100% of that was planning. 100% of the time when teacher educators were talking about justice in relationship to teaching, that they were talking about either planning or teaching or instruction. 100% of the time, it was about planning when they were talking about justice. It was never about the decisions made while students are present. In the novice teacher reflections, that was 90% recorded as planning. So that's actually quite a strong relationship between the way that teacher educators taught about teaching in relationship to justice and then what novice teachers went on to reflect on about their own teaching. It got taught as a planning issue when it got taught about teaching, and that then moved into what the novice teachers actually understood about their own teaching. This is kind of a complex idea. So I'm going to take you into one thing. So I just said 190, but you have to remember that not everything was coded with a planning code or an instruction code. So what that meant is of the total data, less than 2% of that data was coded with a centering justice code and a direct instruction code. Right? So that's very, very little amount of the data was actually thinking about justice while making decisions while students are in the room. That wasn't getting represented or decomposed or approximated for novices at all. Except 2% of the time. So 2% of the data on it. I think diving into that data is incredibly instructive because that's what I think we're not doing in teacher education. We are not preparing novices to make decisions about how to center justice in their decision making while kids are in the room, while they're faced with the in-the-moment decisions that teaching entails. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us into the novice teacher whose work was in this 2% and show you what it was she was actually doing as she reflected on her teaching, because I think it can be instructive to us in teacher education to think about what that work looked like. So I'm going to take you into this one woman's classroom. Her name is Sophia, or that's her pseudonym. She's teaching in a rural K-5 school. She is a Latinx woman. Most of her students are Latinx. The majority of her students are also emerging bilinguals. And she is reading aloud to them a story called Harvesting Hope, the story of Cesar Chavez. She has videotaped this lesson, and she has written a reflection watching herself engaged in an interactive read aloud with her students of this book. And I'm going to take you into the 2% of the data as a whole, which some of it was in her classroom, of her reflecting on how she centered justice while making in-the-moment instructional decisions that weren't planning decisions. Because most teachers, when they reflected, they were like, I chose to read Harvesting Hope. It's about Cesar Chavez, who's a justice fighter. So I have made a social justice decision. It is a good decision. I think that people should make that decision, but there's more. There's more to do. And Sophia's reflection shows us what that is. So she says in her reflection, One moment in the lesson where I think I did particularly well in listening and responding to students was when I asked students to reflect on what some white people who were not farm workers thought of Cesar and other farm workers. The question was attempting to get at the fact that white people in the towns treated Cesar and others like him poorly because of their racial identity and their work. Then she says, I had planned on asking the students how they thought this made Cesar feel after they addressed the first question. However, after the turn and talk, students immediately started answering how Cesar felt without me first asking the question. So here she's facing a dilemma that teachers face all the time, right? Which is she had planned a certain way, the kids end up doing something she didn't anticipate, and she has to make an in-the-moment decision about what to do next. This is a constant activity of a teacher. You are constantly facing a moment you didn't quite anticipate, having to make a decision. So the students have skipped something that she planned to do later in the lesson, and they've gone to write what it is she planned to do. She has to figure out what to do next. She says, instead of redirecting students to my original question, I directed the conversation towards how Cesar felt, using connections to my students' feelings. For instance, I tried to tap into their background experiences by asking how they would feel if they were told not to speak Spanish in the classroom. Additionally, because the students share many similarities with Chavez, it may have been unnecessary to go through how white people felt about farm workers to get to the content objective. Most of my students are surrounded with less overt forms of white prejudice and therefore need less processing time to get to the eventual objective of the question, to infer how Cesar felt. So I want to point out a few things that she's saying here. She's decentering whiteness inside of her own thing. She's saying, I actually don't need them to talk about how the white people feel in this moment. They probably already have a good sense of that as people who are constantly surrounded by white prejudice. She's attempting to build feelings of solidarity by asking the students how they would feel if they were told they couldn't speak Spanish in the classroom. She's honoring students' choices, and she's acknowledging that students likely have experiences with oppression that they can bring to bear on the understanding of the text. She's using a lot of knowledge that she has about justice issues and about oppression in order to make an in-the-moment decision in relationship to a student discussion that's going on. She ends by saying, eliciting and responding to students in my classroom also meant knowing and accepting their background knowledge and experiences as affecting the root to the content. I just included that in the comments. This led us to have a lot of remaining questions. One, we wanted to know why it was so rare for novices to identify issues issues related to justice as informing their in-the-moment instructional decisions. We want to know whether offering representations, decompositions, approximations of that kind of work that we just saw Sophia do, actually, like, can you break down the work of looking at a moment and making a set of decisions using all of that knowledge that she used and help people take that up? Would that actually improve the amount of stuff we saw in the novice reflections? Would designing opportunities to practice this type of instructional decision making, to practice it, to say, all right, we're gonna work today on decentering whiteness in discussions about race. I want you to watch me do that. I'm gonna fail a little bit, right? Sometimes I'm not gonna do it perfectly, and we can talk about that, but I want you to take notes. Every time I do it, I want you to take notes of, well, what is it that I did and how did I do it? And then you're gonna go and you're gonna practice. And we're gonna see how it goes. It won't be perfect, but it'll give us an opportunity to practice the thing that the environment pushes against when you get into schools. To expect that people can practice that outside of our own scaffolding of those kinds of experiences is, I think, naive. So what does all this mean for teacher education? I think it means this. To me, it means this. We can talk about it. I think social justice teaching is typically conceptualized as beliefs, orientations, dispositions, awarenesses, commitments, things that sit inside of a person. And rarely is it conceptualized as practice. And by practice, I don't mean discrete habits that are the same every time. What I mean by practice is embodied knowledge and beliefs. Actions that putting beliefs and knowledge into actions. And that the work of the relating of action to thought and to belief is actually complex hard work that people need practice with. So I have this, to get deeper into this idea of what do we mean when we say practice. I think of practice as the exercise of judgment. I'm also starting to think about it a little bit as the embodiment of affect as well. Not as the executing of techniques. But I do feel really strongly that even if you're practicing the exercising of judgment, you need opportunities to see it, and you need opportunities to practice it, to attempt it, and to receive that. So this is a model of that I've been playing around with. The teachers are constantly facing dilemmas. So moments of teaching when they have multiple alternatives, when they go in any direction, they have to make a decision. They have to use their judgment to encounter that dilemma. They make a decision, they enact a move. The move inevitably leads to another dilemma, which they inevitably have to use their judgment to deal with. So if this is the work of teaching practice, developing rehearsals, developing opportunities to practice, developing approximations will allow people to actually draw on professional judgment in order to enact moves is really important work, and it's work that folks in practice-based teacher education have been working on for quite some time. However, I would argue that we have to begin to do similar kinds of work, rehearsing, teaching, etc., but bring different knowledge to bear so that people can practice making decisions based on their knowledge and beliefs about bias, about oppression, about marginalization, about culture, race, class, gender, and that if we develop opportunities to actually see and practice that, we might see differences in what novice teachers go on and do in classrooms with kids. So just a brief thing about where I'm taking this work next, and then we can talk. I have a lot of projects going on right now, too many for myself because I just don't know how. But one of them I'm going to talk really briefly about, which is this Learning Labs project that I'm doing in the School District of Philadelphia. So I'm working with a group of teachers, novice and in-service teachers together at one school. And we are, over the course of 2 years, teaching together. So we plan lessons together. We then teach those lessons together, and then we debrief those lessons. We all go into the classrooms together to teach. And we're reading only, it's all in literacy classrooms, 4th through 8th grade. And we're reading short stories, so literary texts, all written by authors of color, all centrally about racial identity development. And we're engaging kids in talking about these texts in relationship to their own experiences and their own racial identity development in classrooms. And we're working together as a group of teachers about what does it look like to keep our knowledge about these things in mind as we make decisions in the classroom about what to do next and why to do those things. So for example, something that happened just 2 weeks ago inside of this classroom was we were reading a text together, and it was a text in which there was a Chinese American narrator, and the kids, 4th grade kids, were talking about how they felt about the narrator, what they could tell about the narrator from the text. And the narrator in this story was expressing some embarrassment. She's a 14-year-old girl. She was expressing some embarrassment about her own culture. And one of the little kids in the classroom, one of these 4th graders, says, she just wants to be normal. And we had to stop as a group of teachers. And we said, okay, what do we do in this moment? And this is a Learning Labs experience where we have to stop and make decisions out loud in front of kids. It's a really different model of professional development. So I said, hey, y'all, I'm Miss Kay. Sometimes teachers just talk to each other and we try to make decisions about what we're going to do next. All right, teachers, what do we think we should do? What do we do with this idea about normal? And somebody said, well, maybe we should ask the kids if they should stop and try and talk to each other about whether normal exists. So I said, oh, it's a great idea. Yeah, let's do that. And we did that, and the kids stopped and they tried to talk. But without opportunities to explicitly practice doing that together, either in a rehearsal environment or in an actual classroom like us, those moments would roll right by. And I think we need explicit opportunities to see and to practice putting beliefs into action if we really want to say that we're engaging in social justice teacher education. Because we can't expect that they're going to happen if we as teacher educators don't take responsibility for creating practice opportunities. So let's talk about it. That's the end of me just talking at you. Now we get to talk together. Instructors were doing some of this modeling, but then the students were also looking at videos of their own instruction. Did you see any differences in the teacher, in the talk in this context between when the instructor was modeling and when they were talking about their own videos? And I ask because when you talk about centering justice, it's culturally relevant to whatever the kids who are in front of you. Yeah. And I don't know what the makeup of the teacher and students
are. So I don't know what exactly the instructors did or could have done in order to ground it in their cultures. But you said that the students were teaching in variety of settings and included minoritized students. So were there differences in the talk between these two contexts?
Yeah, so I mean, what I saw a lot inside of the videos of teacher education modeling was not so much. One, I didn't see a lot of modeling, right? This is, and I think that some of it is because of the thing that you're bringing up, which is I think we as a scholarly community have put our stake in the ground that cultural responsiveness isn't just cultural responsiveness. It's different in every context because the whole point of it is that it's contextually determined. And so I think that has real, like, the thing I'm saying about an absence, it comes from a real place. It comes from a real concern that we have as teacher educators about not wanting to make like the rules of cultural responsiveness, right? But I do think this is sort of an answer to your question, but I'm also going off in another direction. I do think we as a community can decide on what are the kinds of questions that I need to ask myself in any context and model what it looks like to ask those questions, right? So to say, let's stop right here. I'm going to show you what I'm thinking about right now. Somebody just said normal, right? That brings up for me a whole lot of questions about what we as a community think normal is, and I want to make sure I trouble those. That's related to a principle that I have, that the principle might be the same in every context, even though the enactment of that principle would be different based on the context. And so what I'm arguing for a little bit is not, let's make a bunch of rules about what cultural responsiveness is and show people how to do it. Instead, it's, can we come up with a set of principles that we think are applicable across all kinds of contexts? And then create opportunities to practice putting those principles into action and show novices what that looks like. Not say the move I made is the right move, right? But say the principle that I used to make a decision about how to act, how to use that move was an appropriate justice-focused principle. And I think we do that a lot, but we don't show people what it looks like to do that in action. Model for them the moment, like step out and say, did you see how I just did that? I was just using that principle, and here's what's going on in my head and why I made that decision. So that isn't quite an answer to your question, but it's what your question makes me think about. So hopefully it answers it in some way. Yeah.
For the students, and I think it really highlights the comfort level as well. On behalf of teacher educators, like I might be able to 50 times in one class show you, student talk and language production and all of that, but how many times can I actually model for you centering justice if I'm not well versed and comfortable with it? So I thought that was fabulous to highlight, especially in practice. But something that came to my mind was there was a lecture here by Deborah Lundberg-Wall, who does like social justice instruction around that, education specifically, and she was able to break down her own practice with students of color. And what I think that does is it collapses the gap between when we're talking about being culturally relevant. If all of my teacher educators, or a lot of them, 80–90%, are like white middle class dominant, kind of, it's hard to, if we're centering them, it's same old, same old. But in her presentation that she shared with us, she was working with youth of color. And so she had a minute-by-minute play-by-play of the pauses that she stopped to disrupt her own patterns of thinking with those students. And I feel like when we talk about like culturally responsive as opposed to social justice, I think those two are related but not the same. And I think if we center social justice, it won't matter who's in the room, because the socio-political consciousness is going to center people of color, whether they're represented in the space or not. So I think that's like things we have to work on as teacher educators ourselves, is to get more comfortable in terms of how to enact centering justice such that we can now reference it as, okay, what did I just do? And why did I do that? And let's turn and talk about that move that I made. I think we have to like collapse it in that way, which is, it's a work. But I do think that the way that you're focusing on, is it in the practice or is it only in the planning? Like that's phenomenal to me as a finding, because it's so reminiscent of what I see.
Yeah, when we came to that finding, we were like, I hadn't thought about it until it was totally visible, until it was 100% of the data, and I just, like, my jaw dropped, and I also thought, of course, I've always known that. It's in every teacher education class I've ever seen. How did I miss it? So I'm glad to hear that it is speaking to you. Yes.
So, the videos, you reflected on how you coded how the students reflected on their own practice, and you found that in 100% of these instances, the planning but never the instruction. Did you ever go back and watch the videos and see maybe it did happen, but it either wasn't intentional or the students just forgot to notice it, or you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say what it is.
Yeah.
That's what, like, I've done other studies where I watch the video and code the video rather than the reflection when I'm looking for other things. But the it of centering justice is actually quite hard to see because so much of it I do think is like a mental process. So in answer to your question, one answer is I don't know what it is, so I don't know what I would see. But two is absolutely, like, at this, I'm going to say two things that are really contradictory. One is I don't know what it is, and the other is yes, I did. There are things that I saw happening in the videos that people did not reflect on that I actually would assume they were actually thinking about issues relating to justice as they made a set of decisions, but I don't know. And it's interesting to me they didn't then put that in their reflection. And my guess is that it might have something to do with the fact that in their teacher education coursework, they were only ever taught about issues of justice as something you think about while you select texts, while you design your plan, while you think about your curriculum, while you interrupt the canon, and not as a set of, like, in the moment frameworks to help you make in the moment decisions. Yeah. Yes.
I think one of the practices that are around confident practice around I think the characterization in those codes shows a sort of lack of detail about testimony practice on the film, right? So those are tensions within the literature that really practices those. So, like, I think this is something that's been kind of brewing for a long time. We have specific examples often with these studies of classrooms that look at some of these practices. If you look across those, you find some commonalities, but I don't think we've had kind of broader kind of discussion about what exactly some of those are, or actually specifying them in the same kind of detail that we have around student costs and so forth. So I think it actually makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it took me, I've been thinking about these questions and this kind of work. I've been wrestling with this question of the relationship between justice and practice for a long time, especially in relationship to teacher learning and teacher ed. And just getting myself to this slide, where I couldn't even begin to think about the things that not to say that would actually be appropriate. It took me a really long time because we, I think, as a scholarly community, haven't thought in those terms, and there are good reasons why we haven't. I think we're afraid of making sort of step-by-step checklists, which tends to be what happens. And we don't want to see that happen here, but there are also downsides to not having the kinds of things. You end up not having the opportunities to really be able to get specific as you prepare people for the kind of work. I want also to go back to this. So even just these things you talk, which are specific, they're also not, so when I think about some people who are identifying practices, they're creating very discrete rules and calling those practices, like cold call. You look at the mob's work on, what is the title of that book that he wrote? Teach Like a Champion, right? If you're going to go teach like a champion, he lists 49 moves. You could specify practice in that way. Even when I'm talking about something, I'm trying not to identify discrete moves that are identifiable only by the behavior.
but actually also connecting the action to the principle behind it. So something like orienting students to each other is both an action that you take, but it's also in its very definition connected to a set of principles that we know about learning. That is that learning is social, and that we actually need to be oriented towards one another's ideas in order to be able to grow those ideas. So I do think that we can and won't actually be doing a disservice to teaching and learning in kids if we can get specific in this kind of way about what kinds of things we want novice teachers taking up as they go into classrooms and do the work of centering justice. Because I think novices right now feel at a loss often about where to even begin, and that doesn't serve kids. And I know the reasons why we have been hesitant as a community to get specific, because of the dangers of specificity, but there are also benefits to specificity, and I think we can do it smartly and in ways that are not damaging. Anything else? Yeah.
I just also thought it was really, like to me, groundbreaking, because in teacher education, we always talk about this a lot, and it is extremely important. So it really turns my thought process on its head to hear you say, like, let's come away from dispositions for a second and talk about practice, because that is the antithesis of what I'm used to orienting students towards, because I'm terrified of the specificity, I'm terrified of the formula, I'm terrified of saying, if you see this, do that. And students in their like very beginning of the journey of trying to understand how to be someone who's social justice oriented, they are looking for prescriptive next steps. What do I do when I see a bunch of X students? Tell me what to do for X students until you try to stay away from that. But in the way that you are defining and conceptualizing what practice means for you, like the way that you said it, makes a big difference to me, because you're literally saying, I don't want the prescribed, physical, things maybe that you could check off almost even in Danielson to say, oh, you did this gesture, or even to teach like a champion moves, you don't opt out, whatever it is. So I thought that was actually, that pushes my thinking in a lot of different ways.
That's so good to hear. You walk into a room people you don't know, and like hearing that it was helpful to somebody is really great. So thank you.